This is the last chapter of Volume 1 of Pride and Prejudice. This is Chapter 23. Elizabeth was sitting with her mother and sisters, reflecting on what she had heard and doubting whether she was authorized to mention it, when Sir William Lucas himself appeared, sent by his daughter to announce her engagement to the family. With many compliments to them and much self-gratulation on the prospect of a connection between the houses, he unfolded the matter to an audience not merely wondering but incredulous. For Mrs. Bennet, with more perseverance than politeness, protested he must be entirely mistaken, and Lydia, always unguarded and often uncivil, boisterously exclaimed, "Good Lord, Sir William, how can you tell such a story? Do you not know that Mr. Collins wants to marry Lizzie?" Nothing less than the complacence of a courtier could have borne without anger such treatment, but Sir William's good breeding carried him through it all, and though he begged leave to be positive as to the truth of his information, he listened to all their impertinence with the most forbearing courtesy. So all of the Bennets are completely shocked by this now. Elizabeth has heard from Charlotte herself, but everyone else is totally shocked, and poor Sir William takes it with very good grace. He was knighted, so as a courtier, so someone who would be involved in the British court a little bit, he is very polite and courteous, despite the Bennets' rudeness and total shock. Elizabeth, feeling it incumbent on her to relieve him from so unpleasant a situation, now put herself forward to confirm his account, by mentioning her prior knowledge of it from Charlotte herself, and endeavored to put a stop to the exclamations of her mother and sisters by the earnestness of her congratulations to Sir William, in which she was readily joined by Jane, and by making a variety of remarks on the happiness that might be expected from the match, the excellent character of Mr. Collins, and the convenient distance of Hunsford from London. So Elizabeth, already knowing about this and seeing that her family is reacting pretty rudely, decides to be the bigger person and congratulate Sir William. And Jane, of course, being as nice and kind and thoughtful as she is, immediately joins in. Mrs. Bennet was in fact too much overpowered to say a great deal while Sir William remained, but no sooner had he left them than her feelings found a rapid vent. In the first place, she persisted in disbelieving the whole of the matter. Secondly, she was very sure that Mr. Collins had been taken in. Thirdly, she trusted that they would never be happy together. And fourthly, that the match might be broken off. So Mrs. Bennet is very upset. She first says that she doesn't believe it. Then she's sure that Mr. Collins is fooled by Charlotte. Third, that they would not be happy together. And then fourth and last, that maybe the engagement will just break off. Two inferences, however, were plainly deduced from the whole. One, that Elizabeth was the real cause of all the mischief, and the other, that she herself had been barbarously used by them all, and on these 2 points she principally dwelt during the rest of the day. So then she comes to the conclusion that it's A, all Elizabeth's fault, and then B, she has been mistreated and misused by everyone, and she's furious. Nothing could console and nothing appease her. Nor did that day wear out her resentment. A week elapsed before she could see Elizabeth without scolding her. A month passed before she could speak to Sir William or Lady Lucas without being rude, and many months were gone before she could at all forgive their daughter. Mr. Bennet's emotions were much more tranquil on the occasion, and such as he did experience, he pronounced to be of a most agreeable sort. For it gratified him, he said, to discover that Charlotte Lucas, whom he had been used to think tolerably sensible, was as foolish as his wife and more foolish than his daughter. Of course, Mr. Bennet takes this with his usual sarcasm and is not too upset about the whole issue. He says, "Wow, I used to think that Charlotte Lucas was a sensible, logical person, but no, she's just as ridiculous as my wife, and she's more ridiculous than my daughter," by which he means Elizabeth, who rejected Mr. Collins. Jane confessed herself a little surprised at the match, but she said less of her astonishment than of her earnest desire for their happiness, nor could Elizabeth persuade her to consider it as improbable. So again, we see Jane being very kind and generous, and she says, "I hope that, they're happy together." Elizabeth apparently tries to persuade her to consider it improbable. So Elizabeth saying it's not likely they're going to be happy together, but Jane is determined to believe the best in people and determined to believe that Mr. Collins and Charlotte Lucas will be happy together. Kitty and Lydia were far from envying Miss Lucas, for Mr. Collins was only a clergyman, and it affected them in no other way than as a piece of news to spread at Meryton. Lady Lucas could not be insensible of triumph on being able to retort on Mrs. Bennet the comfort of having a daughter well married, and she called at Longbourn rather oftener than usual to say how happy she was, though Mrs. Bennet's sour looks and ill-natured remarks might have been enough to drive happiness away. So Lady Lucas is also sort of gloating now, just as Mrs. Bennet gloated with the idea of Jane and Bingley one day getting engaged. Mrs. Lucas is now gloating in the fact that Charlotte and Mr. Collins are actually engaged. So Lady Lucas and Mrs. Bennet seem to have one of those friendships where there's an edge of competitiveness, and it seems that Lady Lucas is happy to have one-upped Mrs. Bennet. Between Elizabeth and Charlotte there was a restraint which kept them mutually silent on the subject, and Elizabeth felt persuaded that no real confidence could ever subsist between them again. Her disappointment in Charlotte made her turn with fonder regard to her sister, of whose rectitude and delicacy she was sure her opinion could never be shaken, and for whose happiness she grew daily more anxious, as Bingley had now been gone a week, and nothing was heard of his return. So Mr. Bingley has been in London for a week. There's been no news of him coming back to Netherfield. There's a little bit of an uncomfortable tension between Charlotte and Elizabeth. Elizabeth is just disappointed in Charlotte settling and being quite so practical with her idea of marriage. So they're not quite as friendly as they are before, and Elizabeth confides and is more concerned, feels closer to Jane because of that. Jane had sent Caroline an early answer to her letter, and was counting the days till she might reasonably hope to hear again. The promised letter of thanks from Mr. Collins arrived on Tuesday, addressed to their father, and written with all the solemnity of gratitude which a 12 months' abode in the family might have prompted. So Mr. Collins sends a thank you letter. He's only been there for 2 weeks with the Bennets, but his letter is as thankful and full of gratitude as it would be as if he had stayed there for a 12-month, for a year. After discharging his conscience on that head, he proceeded to inform them, with many rapturous expressions, of his happiness in having obtained the affection of their amiable neighbour, Miss Lucas, and then explained that it was merely with the view of enjoying her society that he had been so ready to close with their kind wish of seeing him again at Longbourn, whither he hoped to be able to return on Monday fortnight. For Lady Catherine, he added, so heartily approved his marriage, that she wished it to take place as soon as possible, which he trusted would be an unanswerable argument with his amiable Charlotte to name an early day for making him the happiest of men. So Lady Catherine approves the marriage, and Mr. Collins says, oh, by the way, that's really why I wanted to come back to Longbourn so soon, so that I could be with Charlotte. Mr. Collins' return to Hertfordshire was no longer a matter of pleasure to Mrs. Bennet. On the contrary, she was as much disposed to complain of it as her husband. It was very strange that he should come to Longbourn instead of to Lucas Lodge. It was also very inconvenient and exceedingly troublesome. She hated having visitors in the house while her health was so indifferent, and lovers were of all people the most disagreeable. Such were the gentle murmurs of Mrs. Bennet, and they gave way only to the greater distress of Mr. Bingley's continued absence. Neither Jane nor Elizabeth were comfortable on this subject. Day after day passed away without bringing any other tidings of him than the report which shortly prevailed in Meryton of his coming no more to Netherfield the whole winter, a report which highly incensed Mrs. Bennet, and which she never failed to contradict as a most scandalous falsehood. Even Elizabeth began to fear, not that Bingley was indifferent, but that his sisters would be successful in keeping him away. Unwilling as she was to admit an idea so destructive of Jane's happiness, and so dishonourable to the stability of her lover, she could not prevent its frequently recurring. The united efforts of his 2 unfeeling sisters, and of his overpowering friends, assisted by the attractions of Miss Darcy and the amusements of London, might be too much, she feared, for the strength of his attachment. So Elizabeth doesn't doubt that Mr. Bingley has feelings for Jane, but she is beginning to get worried that now he won't come back to Netherfield because his sisters want to keep him in London. Mr. Darcy, who we know Mr. Bingley respects and values his opinion, may also want to keep him in London. Maybe Georgiana Darcy is very nice and pretty. Maybe he will end up liking her more than Jane, and maybe all the fun going on in London will be more interesting for him than being more in the country and at Netherfield. So now Elizabeth is starting to worry, although she, in the past, had reassured Jane that Mr. Bingley would be back. As for Jane, her anxiety under this suspense was, of course, more painful than Elizabeth's, but whatever she felt she was desirous of concealing, and between herself and Elizabeth, therefore, the subject was never alluded to. But as no such delicacy restrained her mother, an hour seldom passed in which she did not talk of Bingley, express her impatience for his arrival, or even require Jane to confess that if he did not come back, she should think herself very ill-used. It needed all Jane's steady mildness to bear these attacks with tolerable tranquillity. So whatever Jane is feeling about Mr. Bingley not returning, she's keeping to herself, but Mrs. Bennet keeps bringing it up and harping on it, which is very difficult for Jane, but she's still maintaining her composure. Mr. Collins returned most punctually on the Monday fortnight, but his reception at Longbourn was not quite so gracious as it had been on his first introduction. He was too happy, however, to need much attention, and luckily for the others, the business of love-making relieved them from a great deal of his company. The chief of every day was spent by him at Lucas Lodge, and he sometimes returned to Longbourn only in time to make an apology for his absence before the family went to bed. Mrs. Bennet was really in a most pitiable state. The very mention of anything concerning the match threw her into an agony of ill humour, and wherever she went, she was sure of hearing it talked of. The sight of Miss Lucas was odious to her. As her successor in that house, she regarded her with jealous abhorrence. Whenever Charlotte came to see them, she concluded her to be anticipating the hour of possession, and whenever she spoke in a low voice to Mr. Collins, was convinced that they were talking of the Longbourn estate, and resolving to turn herself and her daughters out of the house as soon as Mr. Bennet was dead. She complained bitterly of all this to her husband. Indeed, Mr. Bennet, said she, it is very hard to think that Charlotte Lucas should ever be the mistress of this house, that I should be forced to make way for her, and live to see her take my place in it. My dear, do not give way to such gloomy thoughts. Let us hope for better things. Let us flatter ourselves that I may be the survivor. This was not very consoling to Mrs. Bennet, and therefore, instead of making any answer, she went on as before. So, when Mr. Collins is visiting Charlotte, Mrs. Bennet thinks that they're talking all about Longbourn and how they're going to inherit it, and that Charlotte is counting down the days until she can kick Mrs. Bennet out and be in control of Longbourn herself. And she tells this to Mr. Bennet, and again, his answer is priceless and incredibly sarcastic. He says, "Oh, don't think of such unhappy things. Maybe you'll die before me." I cannot bear to think that they should have all this estate. If it was not for the entail, I should not mind it. What should you not mind? I should not mind anything at all. Let us be thankful that you are preserved from a state of such insensibility. I can never be thankful, Mr. Bennet, for anything about the entail. How anyone could have the conscience to entail an estate from one's own daughters. How anyone could have the conscience to entail away an estate from one's own daughters, I cannot understand, and all for the sake of Mr. Collins, too. Why should he have it more than anybody else? I leave it to yourself to determine, said Mr. Bennet. So Mr. Bennet is unperturbed, mostly, by all of this news. Mrs. Bennet ends that volume very, very unhappy with the whole situation. And that is chapter 23 of Pride and Prejudice, and that is also the end of volume 1.